Oh no, do you need paper?
I have it.
Okay, before we get started, a couple of announcements. I noticed when I attempted to log on, the computer still doesn't recognize that I belong here. But it did say that the 22-23 scholarship applications were open, so if any of y'all are interested in that, hit that. I'm going to pass these around. This is another volunteer. This are another extra credit opportunity. I'll give you 10 points if you do at least one shift at Christmas at Old Fort Concho. How many of y'all are from here? 1, 2, 3. Have you ever been to Christmas at Old Fort Concho? It's fun.
I love it.
This gets you in free. So you get in free the day you volunteer. So if you volunteer for like a 2 to 4 shift on Saturday, you can come when we open. You can stay after your shift. So saves you money and gets you extra points. And it helps us out because we need volunteers. You can take more than one of these. If you have friends, I can't give your friends extra credit, but I can give you extra credit. And I can't give you extra credit for your friends. I'm only going to give you 10 points, but it is 10 points. And we didn't get to have Christmas last year, so we're all kind of excited that we're going to get to do it this year. We had a really sad weekend, all the people that work there, because it's always the first full weekend of December, and it's like 3 days of organized chaos. And last year we just sat at home, and it was sad. It was kind of nice in a way because I didn't have to deal with people, but it was still sad.
So what days is it?
It's the 3rd, 4th, and 5th this year. And I know that's the weekend before finals, and take that into consideration, because if you're one of those people that just really has to cram the whole time, don't do it. But for a lot of people, having a break is nice. You know, take your break and earn some extra points. Consider it added points on your test. Anybody else? Okay. I want to say there was something else I was going to talk to you about. And I can't remember what. Okay, I guess it doesn't matter. When we stopped with Shay's Rebellion. Now the fear of the founding fathers and people in charge is not just that this republic can be threatened by tyranny from a single, look behind you, a single leader, but it can also be threatened by tyranny of the majority. So many are calling for a stronger constitution. And in 1787, Congress finally endorsed a convention to be held in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. Now, that's important. This is a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. By the time it had been stated, 5 states had already named their delegates. By the meeting date on May 14th, 6 more had been sent. New Hampshire kind of held off. They delayed until June and July. They sent a few in June and some more in July. Rhode Island didn't participate at all. So 29 delegates from 9 states began work on May 25th. 73 men were elected to this committee. 55 attended. 39 eventually signed the document that they produced, and 3 refused. It was an interesting group of people. They were surprisingly young. The average age was 42. There were farmers, merchants, lawyers, bankers, people from all walks. They were men of intelligence and men of experience. Many had served in the war. 21 had served in the war. 7 had served as state governors. Most had been members of Congress at one point or another. And 8 had signed the Declaration of Independence. George Washington presided over the convention, but he didn't participate as much. 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin, undoubtedly the oldest one there, probably skewed the average a little bit, so they could have actually been younger than 42. Provided experience, wit, and common sense. He didn't he played more of a backroom role than actually a major role in the committee. And you're going to have to come back to that one. The main players in all of this were James Madison. Madison was a younger man. He was a philosopher. He was a politician. He was extremely intelligent, very well read, came to the convention with a trunk of books. He was shy. He was unassuming. He had a high, squeaky voice that he didn't like to use in public. And he becomes one of the major leaders, major players in this convention. Elbridge Gerry from New York, they called him Old Grumbletonian because he didn't, if it wasn't his idea, he grumbled about it. He was from New York. He was a lawyer, and he was, well, Grumbletonian. He was negative. He was a very negative person. George Mason from Virginia. Madison was also from Virginia. Mason had been part of the government. He'd been part of this movement since the revolution, since before the Revolution. He had written part of Virginia's Constitution and Bill of Rights. He's kind of a suspicious slave-holding planner. He, at one point, had been more liberal, but he's getting a little more conservative. Governor Morris, and yes, his first name is Governor, spelled very weird, was a New York aristocrat. James Wilson is a Scottish-born lawyer from Pennsylvania. And Roger Sherman, who was a lawyer from Connecticut and is a consummate negotiator. He can work out compromises. He can get people to agree, to disagree, but yet come to some meeting of the minds. All of them agreed on one thing, that government derives the power from the people, but society must be protected from the tyranny of the majority. And they start out with two different plans. There's the Virginia plan. And from the beginning, James Madison kind of directed the framework of the discussions. And the Virginia plan was his plan. Scrap the instructions to revise the Articles of the Confederation. So basically, he's saying, go against what Congress sent us here to do. Submit a new document to the states that would have a separate legislature, executive, and judicial branch, and create, oh, hang on, I'm jumping ahead. The legislature would be two houses, much like Parliament, one chosen by popular vote and one chosen by the states. And Congress would be allowed to disallow state laws and define the extent of its and the state's authority under this plan. So that what he is proposing is to create a truly national government with laws that are binding on the individual citizens as well as the states. The Articles of Confederation doesn't really go into individuals. It's more of a contract between the states and the federal government. The other plan is the New Jersey plan. The New Jersey plan was to follow the instructions and just revise the articles. They would keep a unicameral or a one-house Congress, but it would give Congress the power to levy taxes and to regulate commerce. And it would allow Congress to name an executive, but it would be a plural executive. So we're still going to have executive by committee. That executive would have no veto, and it would also allow Congress to create a Supreme Court. So the first big question is, do you follow the directions that Congress gave and amend the Articles of Confederation, or do you go against what the government wants and scrap the whole thing and start over? So in a sense, it is, do you follow the law or do you break the law? They were sent there on a specific purpose. They weren't sent there to start over. But there's problems. Right now, Congress, the Articles of Confederation aren't working. And there are certain things that both sides realized. There was a need to limit state power on things like issuing money, making treaties, contracts, waging war, levying tariffs. All of these things were things that the federal government needed to be able to do, but the states at this point are doing. And it's causing issues. The other big question that gets involved in this is, how do you pick congressional representation? Do you do it based on state, or do you do it based on population? And you would think you could answer the question of amend or scrap before you work these things out, but they play a big role. Northern states want, or the bigger states want population. The smaller states want representation to be built on states. The South wants everyone counted, slaves included. Well, they don't even want to count. Okay, all men counted. They don't want women counted. The northern states don't want the slaves counted because that ups the population, and could adjust South Carolina would have more representatives if you count the slaves than it does if you don't, and give them more power. And they had to work these two questions out before they could even really decide which direction they wanted to go. So in steps Roger Sherman. Girls, with the Great Compromise, slavery was the most volatile issue. Like I said, the South wanted them counted for representation, the North for taxation. So they compromised. Slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person for both issues. That meant South Carolina would pay more taxes, but they would also get more representation. And the North was happy because they were getting more taxes paid by other states, and the South was happy because they're getting more representation. They also, as part of this compromise, addressed the slave trade. Now, most states by this point are not importing slaves anymore. A couple are. After 1808, according to this compromise, there would be a tax of $10 per slave on imported slaves. That's a lot. I mean, $10 to us does not sound like much, but $10 in 1787 was a lot of money. Of course, women aren't counted, despite some efforts to get female participation. It doesn't matter. Immigration is the other big issue. As part of the compromise, the delegates agree that if we go with the Virginia plan and there is a president, the president must be a natural born citizen. That was kind of a stab at Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was born in the West Indies, and there's a large faction that doesn't like Hamilton and doesn't want him to have a chance at being president. So that was part of it. The other part of it is they feel like if you're going to be president, you need to be a natural born citizen. For the House and the Senate, you had to have been a resident of the United States for 7 years for the House and 9 for the Senate. You could have foreign born, but they had to have been in the United States for a while. So they pretty much decide they're going to go with the Virginia plan. Once they work out these issues of population and slavery and immigration. So now you, in a sense, have a rogue convention. They're not doing what they were told to do, but they're going to come up with a really extremely radically different constitution document is what I was going to say. So they start delving into it. The House is going to be, under the legislature, the House will be the entity that is closest to the people. Members of the House will be elected by popular vote every 2 years with the idea that they will be responsive to the needs of their constituents. And if they're not, they're going to get voted out. And they've only got 2 years to prove themselves. The Senate was to be the more detached House. They were staggered 6-year terms. So every 3 years, you would have an election for half of the House. And then 3 years later, you would have another election for the other half. They were appointed by the state legislatures. Supposedly, you know, the state legislatures are working in the best interest of their constituents, but it's a step removed. So as a senator, yeah, you need to respond to Joe Blow when he writes you a letter and complains about taxation in his district, but he's not actually going to vote for you. So you really don't have to pay as much attention as if you were a House member and he wrote you with a complaint. The executive caused, the legislature was a kind of a no-brainer. Almost all of the states had bicameral legislations. The colonies had bicameral legislations. Parliament was a bicameral legislature. That one was pretty easy. The executive branch caused them more problems. They still fear the power of a single person being in charge. But they figure if they put enough checks and balances, it'll work. So you're going to have a single executive who would have veto over Congress. So Congress is going to make the laws, but the president can say, nope, don't like that one. We're going to override that one. Or we're going to veto it. But then Congress can turn around if they have enough support and override it. So there's one check. He would also be the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Technically, he still is, but he isn't. It's morphed over the years where he's still the commander-in-chief, but he can't actually go out and order troops around. There's a power structure under that. He could make treaties, but only with the consent of the Senate. He can appoint diplomats, judges, and other officers, but again, has to have consent of the Senate. And he has to make an annual State of the Nation report and tell everybody how wonderful the country is and what wonderful things we're doing. He could recommend legislation, cannot make legislation, but he can suggest it, cannot declare war or peace, and most importantly, he can be removed from office. Doesn't happen often, but it's written in. there is a method, there is a way, and it's very confusing because they use the word impeach both to indict and to find guilty. So a president can be impeached and still not leave office, because you can be indicted and then found innocent. But there is a method for removing people from office. One of the big holdups comes over how do we elect our president. Madison, Wilson, and Hamilton wanted a straight popular vote. Just vote for the president. But that fear of the tyranny of the majority, a distrust of common people by people in power, overrules that, and they go with an electoral system. And I'm sure you're all, I mean, this whole part sounds like a civics lecture, but it is part of the history. So they go with the electoral system. Each state, so you have a popular vote in a state, but you're actually voting for electors, who are men who are then going to go to Washington and vote on the president. Originally, it was conceived that those men would use their own good common sense once they got to Washington. There was nothing binding them to a chosen candidate. So if you were an elector and you said you were representing Washington, and everybody who wanted Washington voted for you, you could go and vote for Jefferson. There's nothing binding you. If something changed your mind between the time you were elected and the time you actually got to the Electoral College, there's nothing binding you other than maybe ethics and a conscience. But the founding fathers didn't build that in. They actually intended that the electors would use their own good common sense. It's never happened. People vote for the person they were sent to vote for. Well, okay, I said it doesn't. It has happened. But for the most part, even in the beginning, people voted for who they were told to vote for. The judiciary branch, there was very little debate over that. Just kind of, we're going to make a Supreme Court. And once we actually get this thing going, Congress will decide how many justices we have. And they don't really designate what the Supreme Court is going to do. It's implied that it is going to review congressional action, which is certainly what it has taken on. That's what it does. But there's nothing actually in the Constitution that says the Supreme Court has the right to decide the constitutionality of any laws. It's just kind of happened. Other issues that they negotiated over were checks and balances. They made sure that, Congress and the executive branches could balance each other out. The Supreme Court would kind of have the final say as a review of congressional action. They wrote into the Constitution a bill of attainder, or that there would be no bills of attainder. That means if Chloe murdered somebody and murder wasn't against the law and they decided, oh, well, murder's bad, that should be against the law, and we're going to write a law that says murder is bad, you can't murder people, they can't try Chloe for it because she did it before they made the law. So they can't Oh, wait, that's okay, I got these backwards. That's the ex post facto laws. Bills of attainder mean they can't make her act criminal by voting in Congress to make it criminal. So they can't take her individual case and say, Chloe was a bad person and she murdered that guy. By legislation action, we're making her a criminal. But the ex post facto laws are the ones that are written after the fact. You can't, you're basically, you're grandfathered in, you can't be held guilty for those. They also discuss states' rights. Basically, things that were not specifically given to Congress or the executive branch or the Supreme Court within the Constitution still belong to the states. There's a lot of laws that the states really need to handle that the national government doesn't. And then finally, in their last act, if you remember back, the Articles of Confederation required a unanimous vote for any amendments or any changes. They changed that. They decide that amendments can be passed by, well, it takes 2/3 vote to propose an amendment and 3/4 to ratify it. And they also decide that 3/4 of the states would be enough to ratify this new document that they're writing. Which 9 states, which is a little more than 3/4, but they submit, fight for ratification. They submit this document on September 28th, 1787. And the fight is on. They've got to convince 9 states that scrapping the Articles of Confederation is the right thing to do, just like they had to convince the other convention goers that scrapping the Articles of Confederation was the right thing to do. And they break into 2 parties, or not parties, 2 groups. You have the Federalists, who are the advocates for the Constitution, and you have the Anti-Federalists, who don't want this. They want to keep the Articles of Confederation and keep going on the way they were. You know, maybe go back to that New Jersey plan, give them a Supreme Court, give them the ability to tax, but they don't want to scrap it. The Federalists have the advantage. They're a better organized group. They honestly have some better leaders in their group. And sometimes, you know, personalities do play a big role. And they have the advantage that the leaders of the Federalists were all members of the convention. They were there when they wrote it. They know what they wanted it to say. And it's easier to explain it when you know what it says than it is to explain it when you don't. They start, well, not start, but part of their attack is to print a collection of essays that were published in the New York newspapers between 1787 and 1788. Alexander Hamilton started this, he instigated it. He wrote 50 of the articles. There's 85 articles total. 30 were written by Madison and 5 by John Jay. If you ever become a Marine, the Marines have a reading list, and this is actually on the reading list. You can read the Articles of Confederation or the Federalist Papers and get credit for it. In these articles, they defend the principle of a supreme national authority while seeking to reassure the doubters that there's little fear of tyranny. There was a belief that a true republic could only work in a small country like the Netherlands, where it's pretty homogeneous, everybody's pretty much the same, you don't have a lot of diversity, and it's small numbers. In the Federalist Papers number 10, Madison argues that size is actually an advantage and would make it impossible for any single faction to form a majority that could dominate. Basically, he's saying there's too many different factions that they're not going to be able to gang up on one group. You know, there's so many different interests in the country that they're not going to be able, no one faction is going to be able to get a majority. The Anti-Federalists push those existing fears of tyranny, and then they point out that unlike the states, there's no Bill of Rights included in this document. There's nothing that's going to guarantee freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of self-incrimination. None of that is included in the original Constitution. Some of the Anti-Federalists were at the convention, like George Mason, and Elbridge Gerry, but you also had men like Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, Samuel Adams, and George Clinton leading that movement. So you have people who have been very active. You know, Richard Henry Lee is the one who actually proposed the Declaration of Independence. These aren't people that don't know what's going on in the government. It's just they're at a different side. But they really push this idea that there's no Bill of Rights. So as the states start deciding, the movement gains momentum before the end of the year. Delaware is the first state to ratify this new constitution. I can always remember that because when I was in 3rd grade, I had to memorize the 50 states in the order in which they entered the Union. The only one I can remember is Delaware. And either Alaska or Hawaii is last. I can't tell you which one. But I can remember Delaware, little bitty Delaware. So Delaware, New Jersey, and Georgia all unanimously endorse the Constitution, followed by Connecticut. So you get 4 out of the 9 you need. Massachusetts was the first close call. The vote was 178 to 187 to 168. My dyslexia is kicking in. And they voted on February of 1788. So you're into the next year. Maryland and South Carolina pass it. New Hampshire becomes the 9th state. At this point, they've won. The Federalists have won. The Constitution can be ratified, but they've got a problem. Virginia and New York have not jumped on board yet, and they are 2 of the most powerful states. They've really got to get them on board. Virginia says it will ratify, but recommends a Bill of Rights, and with sort of a head nod agreement that, yeah, we'll think about this we'll work on the Bill of Rights. New Hampshire, North Carolina, and finally Rhode Island kick in. But as soon as New Hampshire had voted, Congress started planning the transfer of power. I mean, honestly, if you were working under the Articles of Confederation and you saw a sign that you could get out, I would. And as soon as they saw that, they start planning. They set a date for elections. Transfer of power is going to happen on September 13th, 1788. And the new seat of government is going to be New York City. On October 10th, the Confederation Congress did its last day of work. So now we have a whole new constitution. And we're going to start the Federalist era. So in 1879, the United States went from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. It had gone from the Atlantic to the Mississippi since the end of the Revolution. But it had grown. There were about 4 million people in the United States. It was larger than any European republic. It has very distinct regional differences, most of which we have talked about. You know, New England is a burgeoning manufacturing sector. The Mid-Atlantic states were the most diverse, had the largest city, the most well-balanced as far as, you know, they have some agriculture, they have some manufacturing, they do some trade. The South was pretty much all agricultural, more homogeneous in a sense. There's less diversity there. You really have two choices. You know, you're either white British descendant or you're African American. But you didn't have like a lot. You had some, but you didn't have a lot of Irish. You didn't have a lot of Germans. You didn't have a lot of Czechs or Swedes. Those are more in the middle. So it's a more homogeneous society. By 1790, they were actually back to exporting as much tobacco as they had before the Revolution, and cotton is becoming, maybe it's a prince at this point. It's not quite king, it's going to be king. But cotton between 1790 and 1850 is going to go from 3 million pounds of exports to 93 million pounds of exports, all because of the cotton gin, but we'll discuss that a little bit more. Overall, it is a rural society, the whole country, when you consider everybody. 80% of the households were agriculture. There were very few cities that had over a 5,000 person population. Only about 125,000 lived west of the Appalachian Mountains. Pretty much all of them were agricultural. Kentucky in 1790 had 75,000 people. They reached statehood in 1792. But by comparison, in 1776, when the Revolution breaks out, there were only 150 people in what is now Kentucky. The population is growing rapidly. There's still cheap land to be had and lots of new opportunities. It's a very young population. In 1790, almost half of the population is under 16. And that has an effect. The average woman would have 8 children in her lifetime. Yeah, when you're a young population and you marry younger, you can have more babies. But that meant they could double the population every 22 years. So it's growing very rapidly. And this is what the new Congress, under this new Constitution, is going to have to deal with. This is the country as they see it. The new government is going to start on March 4th, 1789. So you have these gaps where really nothing's going on at the federal level, but life goes on. People still have to You still have to feed the animals, you still have to get the crops in, you still have to load those ships and send them across to Europe. You don't need day-to-day governing. So the gaps don't really affect people too terribly much. So on March 4th, the new Congress meets with only 8 senators and 13 representatives. It's going to take a month before they can get a quorum. If you've ever been on a board, a quorum is what you need in order to make anything work. Usually it's over half. George Washington was certified president. John Adams was certified vice president. One of the things that they didn't take into account with the electoral system, it's just by vote. If 100 people vote and 75 vote for Washington and 25 vote for Adams, okay, Washington's first, Adams second. The idea of political parties has not dawned on anybody yet at this point. Washington was apprehensive as a new president, really didn't want to be president, but accepted it. And he pleads for national unity and for people not to get political. He's pleading with the politicians who are coming to Washington to please don't be political. Obviously, that's going to fall on deaf ears. But, at this point, we really don't have political parties. You have factions. We've seen that with the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. And you most definitely have personalities. And those personalities are going to lead to what we know as political parties. First thing Washington does is he names a cabinet. There is absolutely nothing in the Constitution about the president's cabinet. Washington sets the first precedent. He names Thomas Jefferson to head the Department of State. Alexander Hamilton will head the Department of the Treasury. Edmund Randolph is going to be the Attorney General. And Washington turns to them for advice. And they meet regularly, and this becomes the president's cabinet. The vice president, if you notice, is not listed anywhere on there. The vice president's job is not, he presides over votes in the Senate. He can be the deciding vote if there's a tie. But as Adams wrote, the vice president position, quote, or vice president position is the, quote, most insignificant office ever contrived. There's no power. There's nothing other than overseeing the Senate. They set up the court system. Congress sets the membership of the Supreme Court at 6, a Chief Justice and 5 associates. They also decide that there's going to be 13 district courts, 1 for each state. There's going to be 3 circuit courts, which are presided over by 2 Supreme Court justices and the district court from that area. And they are going to meet twice yearly. John Jay is named the first Chief Justice, and he will stay Chief Justice until 1795. And they also get started on the Bill of Rights. It's requested by Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, and North Carolina. James Madison presents the 12 amendments that will be considered. They're approved on September 17, or September 1789. I don't have the date. And they were sent to the states to be ratified by the end of 1791. And they become effective in December of 1791. And then when we come back, we will actually talk about what those Bill of Rights contain. Y'all have a great weekend. You want to volunteer for them too?
Oh, yes.
You get extra credit for that.
Do I get to give this to you, or do I have the honor of going here myself?
You can do either.
Can I give it to you?
Yes.
Are we gonna watch the Schoolhouse Rock Bill of Rights?
Yeah. Did you get one of the volunteer forms? Or do you want one?
I didn't.
Okay, so I'll give you 10 points if you volunteer.
Okay.
Each time or just one?
Just one.
I don't think I signed the.
Well, you most certainly want to do that. And if you didn't get one of those, you can pick one.
Okay.
What are the little, oh, okay, never mind.
And y'all are welcome to bring, if you have a friend that wants to volunteer with you, I can get you more forms.
Ooh, Bill of Rights.
Yeah. Where are y'all at in your class?
We are, let's see. Articles of Confederation.
Oh, good. Y'all are behind us.
Oh, wow. They're being this.
I was worried.